The restaurant was bustling with activity that evening, its polished floors and dimly lit chandeliers exuding an air of sophistication. Patrons filled nearly every table, their laughter and conversation creating a warm hum of energy. Among the staff, servers moved with precision, balancing trays laden with gourmet dishes and expertly poured drinks. At the center of it all was Adrian, a young waiter with sharp features and an air of self-importance. Adrian had worked at the upscale establishment for 3 years, and in that time he had developed a reputation for being efficient, if not entirely pleasant. Adrian prided himself on his ability to handle difficult customers, though his approach often leaned on passive-aggressive remarks and thinly veiled disdain for anyone he deemed beneath him. Tonight, his mood was particularly sour. The night had been long, and the tips had been mediocre. As he glanced at the clock, he muttered under his breath, "Just a couple more hours." It was then that the door swung open, and an elderly black man stepped inside. He was dressed simply but neatly, in a pressed shirt and slacks, a weathered hat perched on his head. He carried himself with quiet dignity, his gaze sweeping the room as if taking in the ambiance. Adrian's eyes narrowed. The man didn't look like the restaurant's usual clientele, the wealthy and influential of the city. Judging by his appearance, Adrian assumed he couldn't possibly afford a meal here. With a forced smile, Adrian approached the man as he stood near the entrance. "Good evening, sir," Adrian said, his tone clipped. "Can I help you?" The man smiled warmly. "Good evening. I'd like a table for one, please." Adrian hesitated, glancing toward the dining area, which still had a few open tables. "We're fully booked tonight," he lied smoothly. "Perhaps you'd be more comfortable at a different establishment." The man's smile didn't waver, though a flicker of disappointment passed through his eyes. "I see," he said softly. "Thank you." He turned to leave, but before he could take a step, another voice cut through the room. "Excuse me, is there a problem here?" Adrian's head snapped around to see Emily, the restaurant's manager, approaching with a curious expression. Adrian's heart sank. Emily was known for her no-nonsense approach to customer service and had little tolerance for anything less than professionalism. "No problem at all," Adrian said quickly. "I was just explaining that we're fully booked tonight." Emily raised an eyebrow, her gaze shifting to the elderly man. "Is that so?" she asked, her tone neutral but probing. The man chuckled lightly. "No harm done," he said. "I can come back another time." Emily's eyes narrowed slightly, and she turned back to Adrian. "We actually have a few open tables," she said pointedly. "Please seat the gentleman immediately." Adrian flushed, a mix of embarrassment and irritation flooding his face. "Of course," he muttered. "Right this way, sir." He led the man to a small table near the back of the restaurant, one that offered less of a view and was farther from the center of the action. Adrian pulled out the chair with exaggerated politeness. "Here you go," he said, his tone laced with insincerity. "Your server will be with you shortly." The man nodded graciously and took his seat, placing his hat carefully on the edge of the table. "Thank you," he said. As Adrian walked away, he muttered under his breath, "This should be interesting." The evening progressed, and Adrian made a point of ignoring the elderly man as much as possible. When he finally approached to take the order, his demeanor was perfunctory. "What can I get you?" he asked, barely looking up from his notepad. The man studied the menu for a moment before saying, "I'll have the filet mignon, medium rare, and a glass of your finest red wine." Adrian raised an eyebrow, momentarily caught off guard. "Are you sure?" he asked, unable to keep the incredulity out of his voice. "That's one of our more expensive dishes." The man's smile remained unchanged. "I'm sure." Adrian scribbled the order down, shaking his head slightly as he walked away. "He'll probably choke when he sees the bill," he muttered to a fellow server, who gave him a disapproving look but said nothing. When the food arrived, Adrian placed the plate and wineglass on the table with a bit more force than necessary. "Enjoy," he said curtly, before walking away without another word. As the evening wore on, Adrian kept an eye on the man from a distance. To his surprise, the man seemed to be thoroughly enjoying himself. He savored each bite of his meal, occasionally glancing around the room with an expression of quiet contentment. He didn't seem to notice Adrian's cold treatment. Or, if he did, he chose not to acknowledge it. When the man finally asked for the check, Adrian brought it over with a flourish, placing it on the table as if presenting a challenge. "Here you go," he said, his tone almost smug. The man opened the bill and glanced at it briefly before reaching into his pocket and pulling out a sleek black card. Adrian's eyes widened. The card was one he recognized, a symbol of significant wealth and status. He swallowed hard as he took the card to process the payment. When he returned, he handed the card back with trembling fingers. "Thank you, sir," he said, his voice now noticeably more respectful. The man signed the receipt and stood, placing his hat back on his head. "Thank you for the meal," he said warmly. "It was excellent." Before Adrian could respond, Emily approached the table once more. "Mr. Carter," she said with a wide smile, "it's so good to see you. I hope everything was to your liking." Adrian froze. "Mr. Carter?" His stomach churned as he watched the man smile and shake Emily's hand. "Everything was wonderful," Mr. Carter said. "You've done a fantastic job with the place." Adrian's heart sank. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. This wasn't just a customer. This man owned the restaurant. Emily turned to Adrian, her expression a mix of confusion and disapproval. "Adrian, did you know this is Mr. Carter, the owner of this establishment?" Adrian stammered, his face turning a deep shade of red. I didn't realize." Mr. Carter held up a hand, his kind smile never wavering. "It's quite all right," he said. "Everyone has off days." But the words, though gentle, carried an undeniable weight. Adrian felt a sinking sensation in his chest, a mix of shame and regret. As Mr. Carter walked toward the door, Emily fixed Adrian with a stern gaze. "We'll be having a conversation about this," she said quietly, before following Mr. Carter out. The next day, Adrian was called into Emily's office. She didn't mince words. "Your behavior last night was unacceptable," she said firmly. "We pride ourselves on treating every guest with respect, regardless of who they are or what you assume about them." Adrian nodded, unable to meet her eyes. "I understand." "Do you?" Emily asked, her tone sharp. "Because what happened last night suggests otherwise. Mr. Carter may have been gracious enough to let it go, but I won't. You'll be taking a leave of absence to reflect on your actions and complete a mandatory diversity training program. If you want to keep your job here, you'll need to prove that you've learned from this." Adrian swallowed hard, nodding again. I'll do whatever it takes." The weeks that followed were humbling for Adrian. The diversity training sessions forced him to confront his biases and examine the assumptions he made about others. He met people from all walks of life, each with stories that challenged his preconceived notions. Slowly, he began to understand the impact of his actions and the importance of treating everyone with dignity and respect. One session stuck with him more than the rest. A guest speaker, a former CEO who had faced significant racial prejudice despite his immense success, spoke candidly about the pain of being judged solely on appearances. Adrian couldn't help but think of Mr. Carter and the quiet dignity he had maintained throughout the evening. he felt a pang of regret so deep that it spurred him to change, not just for the sake of his job, but for the sake of his own humanity. When Adrian returned to work, he was a changed man. He approached every table with genuine warmth, treating each guest as though they were the most important person in the room. It wasn't just about keeping his job anymore. It was about making amends and becoming a better person. One evening, as he was clearing a table, he glanced up to see Mr. Carter entering the restaurant. This time, Adrian didn't hesitate. He approached with a sincere smile. "Good evening, Mr. Carter," he said. "It's an honor to have you here." Mr. Carter regarded him for a moment before nodding. "Thank you, Adrian. It's good to see you again." Adrian seated him at the best table in the house, ensuring every detail of the service was flawless. He personally attended to Mr. Carter, checking in to ensure his meal was perfect and his experience unmatched. By the end of the evening, as Mr. Carter prepared to leave, he paused and looked at Adrian with a knowing smile. "Growth is never easy," Mr. Carter said, his tone gentle yet profound. "But it's always worth it." Adrian felt a lump in his throat as he nodded. "Thank you for giving me the chance to grow," he replied earnestly. As Mr. Carter walked out, Adrian stood straighter, feeling a sense of redemption and newfound purpose. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was an opportunity to make every moment count and to honor the lessons he had learned. Change begins with humility, and every act of kindness builds a better world. Adrian's journey reminds us that respect and humanity are the true marks of growth. If you enjoyed this story and want to see more, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring content.